So I am very pleased to be here to chair the panel on artificial intelligence and its ethical considerations. As you can hear from part of my bio, this is an emerging part of my own research agenda, although I'm more in the kind of law and civil military relations part of it. So I'm really looking forward to what our three panelists here are going to present today. So let me just remind everybody who's on the panel, and then I will begin by introducing our first speaker. Then she's going to present, then I'll introduce the second speaker, then he will present, and I'll do the same for the last speaker. And then once we're done all of that, then we're going to have a Q&A. And I'm hoping that, if this is okay, Christopher, if we could just have people in the Q&A just raise their hands, because like I can't manage the Q&A function. So I'm used to running seminars just with people raising their little yellow hands or their actual hands. So maybe we'll just do the Q&A that way. So without further ado, our presenters are in the following order: Megan Martins Da Ponte, Dimitri Perepelkin. Is that sort of close?
That's correct. Yes.
Thank you. And Teresa Quadros. So we'll start with Megan Martins Da Ponte. Let me just say a little bit about Megan. Of course, Megan is one of our students here at CMSS. So she's doing her Master's of Strategic Studies. That means she's a thesis candidate at the University of Calgary. She will be pursuing her doctoral studies this fall at Carleton University, which I'm very pleased to hear, especially since I did my master's at Carleton and I had an excellent experience there. So I'm really pleased to hear that. Her thesis analyzes the ability of medium power navies to manage technological change in an increasingly high-tech maritime domain. In addition to her studies, Megan is a graduate fellow with the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network and research coordinator at the Conference of Defense Associations Institute. Megan has received the Arthur J.E. Child Master's Scholarship and the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies Graduate Research Scholarship. Previously, she graduated with a Bachelor of Arts honors in political studies from the University of Manitoba, just like me, except I got mine 500 years ago. And she is an alumnus of the 2018 NATO Field School and Simulation Program at Simon Fraser University. Megan's research interests include sea power, naval warfare, Arctic security, and the military applications of emerging technology. And with that, I will turn it over to Megan.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Hiebert. Let's see, I'm just going to share my screen. Did that work?
Yeah, you're all good.
Perfect. Sorry, there's been a little. Okay, perfect. All right, so good afternoon. My name is Megan Martins Da Ponte. Thank you, Dr. Hiebert, for that lovely introduction. My presentation today will discuss the naval applications of emerging technologies linked to the fourth industrial revolution within the near to medium term. More specifically, in how these enabling technologies can be leveraged by medium naval powers like the Royal Canadian Navy to optimize operational efficiency and enhance force readiness. As the thematic focus of this panel is ethical considerations of artificial intelligence, I have been asked to adjust my presentation accordingly, and we'll be speaking on one of the many technologies linked to the 4IR, which is AI. So quick presentation outline. So my research argues that the potential benefits of the 4IR technologies, in this case AI, is dependent upon the capacity for adoption, as the raw characteristics of these technologies do not directly translate into a user advantage. This argument was prefaced upon two core questions: what is the 4IR and what is its significance to medium power navies within the near to medium term? This time frame is important. AI claims are often overly optimistic, and the failure to acknowledge limitations of technological advancements risks an over-reliance on technology that may fall short of expectations. As such, I chose to narrow the scope of my research to focus only upon technology that is accessible in the present day. My second question: what are the near-term opportunities and vulnerabilities linked to AI within the context of the maritime domain? Essentially, how do we go from good enough AI to good AI? So to begin with the first question, what is the 4IR? So this was a concept popularized by World Economic Forum founder Klaus Schwab in 2015. He argued that society has entered into a fourth industrial revolution built upon the 3IR, or the digital revolution, of which electronics and information technologies to automate production. The 4IR is characterized by the fusion of technologies that is blurring the lines between the physical, digital, and biological spheres. What distinguishes this from the third industrial revolution is the velocity, scope, and systems impact. The pace of technological change society is now experiencing is unparalleled through history. Technological evolution has become exponential rather than linear, as it has in the past. Furthermore, it is disruptive to virtually every industry. The breadth and depth of these changes is believed to have capacity to transform entire systems of production, management, and governance. The future will be interconnected with unprecedented processing power, storage capacity, and access to knowledge, the possibilities of which Schwab has argued will be multiplied by emerging technology breakthroughs. I have it here on the slide, but AI is one of those key ones. As is the case with all research, and trying to answer this one question, I've highlighted a multitude of others, many of which I've yet to find the answer to. But my initial concern was the scope. The 4IR describes an uncertain time frame and a variety of emerging technologies, many of which very little is known about their military applications at this time. For this reason, I selected two technologies in my initial paper, AI and 3D printing, both of which have been used across different commercial sectors, as well as within the maritime domain. The intent behind my research is not to simply say the Navy needs AI or AI represents a solution to personnel shortages, but instead to identify areas of opportunity, methods to facilitate greater trust, and lessons to be learned from other industries to enhance current force structure. Rome was not built in a day, and neither was the Royal Canadian Navy. My next concern centered upon the question of evolution or revolution. The 4IR is a concept to describe growth and connectivity of disruptive technologies. Yet we also must be mindful that this is a period we're currently living in. So unless Schwab has a crystal ball predetermining these technologies as revolutionary, we fall into the overly optimistic category I mentioned earlier. So what is the difference and why does it matter from a medium naval power perspective? Industrial revolutions are more than simply time periods where new technologies are developed and introduced. Rather, they involve technological change that have a particular set of characteristics that are connected to and occur with broader societal transformation. Considering that navies are particularly sensitive to changes in technology, since it affects both the platforms as well as the weapons that are necessary for combat at sea, it's useful to look at how navies have adapted during periods of profound change. For example, the first industrial revolution brought about steam power and mechanized production, resulting in a dynamic increase in capacity and productivity, leading to an increase of regional and global market economies. Steam power extended the global reach and ability at sea, which stimulated economic growth, which allowed for further development of maritime capabilities. Second industrial revolution, we saw greater standardization, greater armor in naval design. Third industrial revolution, which bloomed alongside the power of data, space race, development of nuclear power. We saw greater networking, and then the advent of nuclear propulsion enabled submarines to remain submerged for longer periods of time, which essentially allowed fleet operations to become more independent of land than they had in the past. This was also a fundamental role shift for naval forces, as ballistic missile submarines became a core component of a state's nuclear deterrent. So while it's useful to look at these periods of industrial revolution to understand changes in naval roles and functions, ship design, organizational culture, and tactics, I would argue that it's more appropriate to understand these changes as evolutionary rather than periods of revolutionized naval power. Technology is an enabler of naval power, not the determinant, which separates the most powerful from the least. The ability to adapt to an increasingly high-tech maritime environment must be understood within the context of the way in which medium naval powers manage the balance between interest and resource constraints. The force requirements of the medium power are twofold: national needs and the price of an alliance. The need to balance a wide range of maritime interests against a limited resource base requires the precise allocation of resources in accordance with political objectives. Therefore, capabilities need to be assessed along two lines: abilities to meet operational demands within the limits of the exclusive economic zone, and the quality of contributions within a cooperative environment. My second question was, what are the near-term opportunities and vulnerabilities linked to AI within the context of the maritime domain? Broadly defined, AI is the ability of machines to perform tasks which normally require human intelligence. Although the technology has potential in current uses across commercial, civil, and military sectors, it is important to differentiate between the types of AI in order to understand what it is and what it isn't within the near to medium term, and how this technology can be implemented into maritime strategy. Artificial narrow intelligence, or weak AI, that's what we have now. So Siri, Alexa, Google Assistant, what we're familiar with. That's machine intelligence that equals or exceeds human intelligence for specific tasks. So it operates within predefined range and lacks self-awareness, consciousness, and genuine intelligence to match human beings. Artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence, that is still within the realm of science fiction. Artificial general intelligence is what would meet the full range of human performance across any task, and superintelligence is what would surpass human intelligence, essentially. So general intelligence, you're thinking TARS from Interstellar, HAL 9000 from 2001: Space Odyssey. This type of artificial intelligence would have the ability to reason, solve problems, make judgments under uncertainty, strategize, and think abstractly. So the dominant AI paradigm since the 2010s has been deep learning or deep neural networks. Deep learning is one method among many in the field of machine learning, which is a subfield of AI in which machines learn from data or their own experiences. Supervised learning methods involve the gradual adjustment of parameters through the repetitive processing of examples in a training set in order to learn the classification of each input. Supervision aspect necessitates the informing the system about the classification of each datum in the training set. This produces highly accurate results due to the specific labeling of data, but also increases the time and complexity. In contrast, unsupervised learning, that can sift through large amounts of data, but it would be difficult for a human operator to acknowledge the accuracy and the explainability. So without specific labels, it's difficult to confirm any results. In between the two is reinforcement learning. So that's inspired by psychological operant conditioning. So learning through trial and error. This procedure requires no labeled training examples. The learning program performs an action in an environment, receiving occasional awards as the addition of positive numbers to its memory. This method learns through interacting with its environment. It is both data and time intensive. However, this method is often able to outperform humans as it learns and corrects errors through the training process. So this brings me to the forefront. How can medium naval powers implement AI and ML in a manner that provides the maximum benefit while minimizes the cost? Here we want to focus on identifying areas in which AI can perform in a manner that is cheaper, faster, and more consistent than human intelligence, but that also fits within the limited scope of narrow AI. So one area would be force readiness. The ability for medium naval powers to defend its interests within the maritime domain is dependent on this. Take Canada, for example, as both a maritime nation and medium power. Canada is faced with the precarious challenge of balancing limited resource base with the ability to protect Canadian maritime interests, which includes, but not limited to, coastal defense, promoting good order at sea, and providing domain awareness. So in terms of education, this has already been successfully implemented into schools and universities to track student behavior. One set example is AI software that's designed to support learning directly through the use of intelligent virtual agents. So essentially that acts as a personal tutor suited to specifically match the needs of the learner. Personalized learning in an individual setting is an effective approach to learning. However, the financial constraints and need for a large number of human tutors makes this an unrealistic approach in most settings. With AI, this learning method would be highly beneficial to new recruits or personnel learning new tasks. The ability of algorithms to identify patterns could pinpoint where personnel are making consistent errors and assist in rectifying bad habits more rapidly than in a large group setting. Second category is collaborative learning. So the use of AI in collaborative learning offers tremendous opportunities for simulation exercises and wargaming at the strategic level, while encouraging teamwork and cooperative learning more generally. The third category is intelligent virtual reality to support authentic environments. So this is more your simulation. Creating and increasing the use of virtual training environments represents a significant opportunity for medium power navies within the near term to allow personnel to have a more hands-on experience with various platforms and systems, despite not being physically located on a specific platform in question. Logistics and maintenance, a central component of operational readiness is naval logistics. So this is the science of planning, carrying out the movement and maintenance of forces, including food, fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, joint supports, weapons. So AI is wonderful with predictive analytics or condition-based maintenance. So instead of waiting for something to break down and then you have surprise delays, you can monitor what's happening. And predictive analytics, it uses historical data to predict future events, typically through building a mathematical model that captures important trends. By definition, this does not necessarily require AI, but AI can sift through data a lot faster. It can standardize the procedure of entries, and it can decrease the possibility of human error.
Oh, Megan, I think we're running out of time for you, probably just another minute or so we'll have enough time for the other two presenters.
Perfect. So I'm just going to really quickly jump into challenges and vulnerabilities. We can get more into this in the Q&A, but essentially the big issues here is there's a concern regarding the loss of human agency. So where do we take humans out of the loop? Second, dependence lock-in. If we're so dependent on these new technologies and we're not reinforcing our skills, that can become problematic. And third, obviously, like data poisoning and deception. In the future, the speed of decision is going to be key to naval operations versus what we're used to, which is the availability of information. So we need to make sure that our AI is transparent and that we are able to understand how we're getting from point A to point B, and that we're not biasing our training data. So I will leave it at that. I apologize.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Let me just make it so that I can see.
Sorry, I have to figure out how to unshare my screen here.
Okay, well, while you're doing that, I will introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dimitri Perepelkin. His topic is, or his paper is, Killer Robots Do Not Kill, the Pentagon Does, a risky account of why actors draw boundaries between machines and humans in regulatory practices. Dimitri is a Master of Arts candidate at the Free University of Berlin. Currently, he works as a student assistant at the Hertie School of Governance in the Department of Advancement and Fundraising, and hosts a weekly podcast on transatlantic relations. Previously, Dimitri studied at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations in Moscow. His research interests include the regulation of autonomous weapon systems, the military applications of artificial intelligence, arms control, and conflict prevention and resolution. Okay, take it away, Dimitri.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And I guess, first of all, thank you for this incredible opportunity to present my findings. And today I'm, just give me a second, I will share my screen. Does it work? Does it work now?
That's good. We can see part of it, sort of taking up a little bit of your screen.
Now you see the presentation, right? Okay, so, and I'm really excited today to kind of tell you a story about why international actors draw boundaries between machines and humans in order to regulate autonomous weapon systems and just to regulate autonomy in weapon systems. And I think this is a really important topic because it reveals kind of a gap in perception that is really detrimental to the regulation of modern warfare practices. So when I think about modern warfare practices, I envision it as a very kind of complex social technique, complex social practice that requires really kind of interaction of many institutional, human and non-human elements to make them work as one. And here you can see on the screen, this is two drone operators of MQ Reaper drone. But even this is just a slice of institutional reality that fits the broader institutional context of the weapon deployment, where weapon deployment is, of course, just a final stage of this context. And in general, it's just very complicated process. And what may seem like a video game from an outside perspective, of course, suddenly turns into a very complex social skill that requires years of education, years of training, and very highly qualified personnel for that. But when it comes to discourse and regulation of autonomy in weapon systems, this complexity really vanishes away, and it turns into these two simplified imaginations or images of autonomy in weapon systems, or to put simply, how the people tend to envision those systems in the future for regulatory purposes. And now I want to kind of present you those two images. And the first image is, I guess you're all familiar with, this is like the idea of a killer robot. And you can find this idea or in media and in academic articles. And this is the idea that has three important kind of components to it. And in general, kind of killer robot is certainly a physical embodiment of a highly kind of autonomous weapon system in the world. And the three important components are the following. The first one is this idea that those machines can endowed with capacity to make life and death decisions, and therefore they have agency. And second point stems from the first one, this idea if those machines have agency and they're not obviously humans, they're kind of like potentially out of human control. And the third point is closely related to first 2 points, is this idea if we have kind of machines that have agency, that are not humans and that are out of control, they're kind of intrinsically precarious and thus they should be banned. And here, like, it's important to notice that kind of killer robots embody a certain program of action, kind of inevitable program of action that kind of goes with this killer robot, so to speak. And the second image for kind of autonomy in weapon systems, autonomy in military, this idea of military artificial intelligence. And this idea is not as definite as kind of the image of a killer robot. So it's very kind of broad. And the way I like to think about it, it's certainly kind of like the myriads of military applications that enable kind of military superiority. And like this idea has three important components to it. Like the first one, it's like those kind of applications enable integration of armed forces into coherent whole. And you can think about such terms as situational awareness or military networks. The second important point is that they reside under human control, because it's kind of tautological to say, but nevertheless important that everything that enters military institutions is, of course, is under strict control and supervision. And third important point is that they usually portrayed as revolution in military affairs, or in other words, they also kind of embody a certain causality and certain program of action, because states kind of have to produce those systems in order to be competitive in the modern warfare practices. And now I want to kind of take those two images and think about those two images as kind of like security frameworks. More broadly, or just you can even think about them, how people tend to think about world politics in general. And those kind of frameworks, they kind of take those images and they try to kind of settle the controversy of autonomy in weapon systems in this or that way. So the first image corresponds to this idea of human security, a very popular idea. And I tend to think about it more broadly as a humanitarianism. And in relation to weapons, humanitarianism really means that the problem is in weapons themselves, so to speak. And this way, it kind of like creates this feedback loop, so to speak, where you have weapons that inform norms, inform society, and society can act upon weapons and bans them. And there's kind of like no way around in terms of this is like the casual loop that you have like with the humanitarianism. Yeah, and in here in this paradigm, like weapons are really kind of like empty screens on which society is being basically projected with its values and beliefs and so on and so forth. So the second security framework, I like to think about it as a real politic thinking, which is very close to the idea of arms race between powerful states. And here you can, and here of course weapons just stand for nothing, in the sense that they just means to achieve desired political or military objectives. But nevertheless, they still embody a certain strong form of causality in the form of force redistribution, because you have structure, first of all, and this structure informs states, and then states can act upon and produce those weapons, so can act upon structure. And here you also have like this feedback loop. And I guess like from these two images, you can see where the problem resides, because those images, they are like drastically opposite, kind of yet symmetrically deterministic, in a way that they really try to ascribe kind of like the violence either to humans or machines. And I guess this really explains why such a very complex topic of autonomy in weapon system, it oscillates from a complete and total ban to that of kind of massive proliferation and total control. And this is the gap in perception that I told you before. And I think it's really problematic. But now I want to explain you why precisely this happens. And here I argue that it happens because like killer robots, it should not be really perceived as kind of definite thing, like any kind of like definite category with a set of undisputable characteristics to it, but rather it's kind of like a recursive and contested quasi-object that carry kind of causality once it's deployed by those frameworks. And what do I mean by that? Here I need to kind of analyze kind of performative nature of those kind of frameworks, or just basically what they're doing in the world and how they try to kind of make any impact in world politics. So, and here with the killer robots, you have, first of all, the campaign to stop killer robots, which was founded in 2013. And the campaign, of course, the main goal of the campaign is to ban killer robots. It kind of unites previous campaigns and it builds upon the success of previous campaigns, such as like cluster munitions and blinding lasers. And the idea is that kind of like by uniting previous campaigns with killer robots, because killer robots is not like such a definite thing as previous campaigns were, because previous campaigns were very material, so to speak, in nature. They were really against like weapons with a detrimental impact and like with the pale of evidence against civilians, for example. It creates this kind of translation, as I call it, that killer robots lead to the loss of humanity. And you can find this translation like in academic articles, the way the problem is presented. So when it comes to military AI, here you can see, like, especially in the third offset strategy, this idea that the Pentagon with military AI, it achieves competitive edge. And of course, our third offset strategy is built upon previous two offset strategies against Soviet Union. And this is the idea that you need to invest as much resources as possible in like different type of technologies, including military AI, in order to be kind of very, like, in order to achieve edge over your adversaries. I think about AI here as it localizes in war rooms or command and control centers. It's the place where you can really kind of feel and touch what does military AI mean actually in practical sense. And it creates this translation we can find in the documents, namely in DoD Directive on Autonomy in Weapon Systems at appropriate levels of human judgment control weapons. And I really want you kind of like to think about this problem in a way when those kind of frameworks, they take the issue, they kind of stretch this problem. And in a sense, it saturates the problem even more, because then you see that it's like kind of black and white issue. It's either total ban or either proliferation and total control, just simply because the way they try to kind of use this object for their own purposes. But so now I want to kind of discuss like, what's the way forward this and what's kind of solution, because I think deeply believe that the solution to regulation is really, it won't be that easy as a campaign to stop killer robots tries to imagine it. Like first, I just want to make like a couple of points on this on this front. First of all, it's like autonomy is very uncertain, diverse, and multiple. They exist like myriads of autonomous functions, and it's really not clear cut, so to speak. It's really open to interpretation, and so on and so forth. The second point is that the act of violence is very redistributed in a series of actions, and will definitely not change in the future. It will become even more kind of intermingled between humans and machines. You can even think about like when we will have brain chips. So like where can you draw a boundary between machines and humans then? And you really need to think about the act of violence as something that's really being redistributed among humans and machines. So you never kind of see either machine or human killing. It's always kind of both object and subject coming together. Then the question is that autonomy and control are not actually mutually exclusive. And you can think about that military institutions have always been kind of like assembled things and machines together to act autonomously. You can think about like a brilliant example of this military discipline, in the sense that the whole system can exert autonomous properties, but not specifically one object or subject for this matter. And then that AI, it really transforms human role in the process. It doesn't eliminate human process, which is really important to think about, because it's not like when we get autonomous weapon systems, we will eliminate any kind of like human role in the warfare, but it will be drastically transformed, of course. And fifth point, which will closely related to the previous one, is this idea that once you introduce military AI, it completely changes actually military institutions and completely changes the outlook of warfare itself. So in this sense, my kind of argument would be that in order to really regulate modern warfare practices, you need to really kind of make kind you need to have certain transparency of what is going inside, like military institution as a Pentagon, because for outsiders, it's really impossible, to be honest, to understand what's really going on inside. And the way I like to think about it, for example, like in the past, you had a lot of books in the 19th century, let's say 20th century, you had a lot of books where people describe how the war goes on. But now it's so invisible to actually outsiders that, for example, for me personally, it's really hard to imagine how does the war look like inside right now, especially like in those advanced militaries and those drone operators and so on and so forth, because there is very little accounts of that and very little even like cultural images or movies or whatever you have. My conclusion would be just very simple. This is like a screenshot taken from Campaign to Stop Killer Robot website, and says like 9 problems with killer robots and only 1 solution. And they imply here that the only solution is the ban. And unfortunately, my argument would be that there are probably 9 problems with killer robots and 9 solutions, in the sense that it will not be clear cut. And in a way, it will be very, very complex way to solve this issue. So thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. That was excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, now we will turn to our third and final speaker, last but not least, as they say, and she is Teresa Quadros. Her paper is Uncertainty in AI Drone Warfare, the Future of Air Security Challenges. Teresa Quadros is an officer cadet pursuing a Bachelor of Arts honors in political science at the Royal Military College of Canada. She is the co-editor-in-chief of Federalism E, an online bilingual student-run journal in collaboration with the Institute of Intergovernmental Relations at Queen's University, and is part of the Electoral Integrity Project, where she works on electoral research with Elections Ontario. Teresa is also interning with the Canadian Military Journal, which is the official professional journal of the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defence. Upon graduation, she will be commissioned in the Royal Canadian Air Force as an aerospace control officer. Excellent. Okay, take it away, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Madame, and I'm really looking forward to this presentation. Let me just share my screen. I hope we can see that, and I will make it a full screen.
Perfect. We can see that. No problem.
Perfect. All right, so I will be talking about uncertainty in AI drone warfare, specifically the legal and ethical challenges that will be posed to the future of air security and air warfare. So the dawn of drones began in the late 20th century, but its role in combat was officially solidified during the Afghanistan conflict and the so-called War on Terror. And whenever a new weapon emerges, a debate will always take place regarding its legality and its ethics in the international system. No such difference for autonomous weapons, which has been described as the third revolution in warfare after gunpowder and nuclear arms. Autonomous systems require internal decision-making capabilities in replacement of a human mind, thus enabling the machine to utilize its network of sensors, information processors, and action nodes to detect, decide, act, and update itself as it operates within the mission environment. This means that they are limited to action within the domain that is built into their decision mechanism. Currently, autonomous and semi-autonomous weapon systems, including drones, are designed to allow commanders and operators to exercise appropriate levels of human judgment over the use of force. You can see this in the current crisis within Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine has been using Turkish-made TB2 drones, which take off, land, and cruise autonomously. However, it still relies on a human operator to decide when to draw the munition it carries. There are 3 usages for most drones. There are unarmed purposes, intelligence, recognitions, surveillance. Armed purposes, which is the remote delivery of lethal force, both inside and outside armed conflicts. This is where my presentation will be focused on. And of course, outside the scope of war, whether that's used for delivery in remote areas during medical crises or during national disasters and humanitarian aid. So modern warfare or contemporary warfare has been tied to the introduction of total war, industrial warfare, mechanized warfare, nuclear warfare, counterinsurgency, and most recently, the rise of asymmetric warfare, which is also known as 4th-gen warfare. These design is outside the realm of conventional warfighting tactics that we have seen in previous conflicts. Thus, we see the introduction of new legal and ethical thoughts. Lethal autonomous weapons are new enablers for achieving political ends through the application of military instruments of power. The lower cost of production, resource efficiency, and the overall capabilities of drones provide several key reasons why many state and non-state actors are seeking to increase their drone arsenals. Currently, there are more than 100 countries and non-state actors that are competitively developing and employing drone technology. There are many legal implications of this new emerging technology, and the use of armed drones is not specifically regulated under international law currently, but their use is still governed by the general rules. They are no different than the pilots of a manned aircraft such as helicopters or other combat aircraft, as far as the obligation for a drone to comply with international humanitarian law. And they are no different in when they're being targeted under the rules, again, of LOAC. All weapon systems, and weapon platforms have to abide and be subject to this international law. The laws of war is a component of international law that governs the conduct within an armed conflict. These laws seek to limit the effects of armed conflict by protecting persons who are not participating directly in hostilities, and also by restricting and regulating the means and methods of warfare. This is where drones come in. It covers the conditions for initiating war, the conduct of armed forces during war, and the responsibilities after war. Ethical and legal considerations are always intertwined, and this is where we start with the just war theory. The just war theory postulates that the belief that war, while itself is terrible, with the right conduct, it is less so. It is not always the worst option in these cases. Responsibilities, undesirable outcomes, or preventable tragedies may justify war, ensuring that it follows the three-pronged approach. The first, obviously, is the right to go to war. This is conditions under which states may resort to war or the use of armed forces. War should always be the last resort. However, under the Article 51 of the UN Charter, self-defense against aggression is a sufficient reason for a just war, for a state to go to just war. But now we have to consider what defines self-defense. Usually that means an imminent attack, when there's specific evidence of when and where an attack is going to take place. This, however, with the rise of asymmetric warfare, is difficult to place, and many arguments have been made for preemptive attacks in order to avoid future war. Our problem arises when drones now are used to target individuals overseas. The use of a military force without the knowledge or the pre-approval of the host nation and the international community to attempt to resolve the problem before utilizing war. One country now could use a drone strike to conduct a targeted killing against someone this country has now deemed as an immediate threat anywhere in the globe. The apparent ease of deploying this new technology has seduced our leaders into thinking we can ignore and evade the traditional standards of legal and ethical implications that justify the use of armed force, just because they are very effective in traditional warfare against these new actors. The second prong of this is the right conduct in war, and it covers 4 principles. All these 4 principles regulate the conduct of both or multiple parties engaged in an armed conflict. This is to make sure that all agents of war are responsible for their actions. The first is the principle of distinction. Who are the legitimate targets in war? Parties of conflict can only engage military targets, whether these are objects or individuals, and they have the disciplinary measure of discriminating between military and civilian objects that are legitimate military nature and those which are not. Drones, in this case, would give a technological benefit to these armed forces to get a clear picture of the targets and its surroundings, and they can be equipped with tracking devices to follow the person or the object that is being targeted. They are also better at identifying targets, as they are able to stay in the air for longer than an onboard human piloted system, as well as these drone systems, rather than having 1 or 2 personnel on the plane, are so aided by a large support of staff, including legal advisors, command teams, civilian defense teams as well, that can discern if the use of force is appropriate, which leads to our second principle, the principle of proportionality, of how much force is morally and legally appropriate in a situation. The expected collateral damage, the adverse impacts on a civilian around the military target, must not be excessive in relation to the direct military advantage that is anticipated, not just what is actually gained, anticipated from any attack that is being planned. The precision in a drone, in this case, in operations, means that the missile fired from the drone usually have a small blast radius and are likely to be unproportional. However, this is heavily dependent on situational context. The third principle here is the precaution to attack. A commander before an attack must obtain the best possible intelligence that the attack is exactly what the military and the armed forces are looking for. This means that a drone that is equipped with video feed features can provide real-time projections and pictures of the targets. This is allowing the commanders to get a better information ahead of the time to provide better warning systems to civilian regions and civilian objects nearby. The fourth is a prohibition of indiscriminate attacks. This includes prohibition of weapons that are incapable of distinguishing between civilian and military targets. The lack of identification whether an object or an individual is military or a civilian does not give a government or a state the right to kill without discrimination. The onus is on the government and the armed forces to identify the combatants, and if there's uncertainty, they may not strike. This comes in a bit of chaos when you start introducing drones, especially autonomous drones, who pick up patterns of life and sometimes rely on discriminatory characteristic signatures in order to identify targets. And this is where we start to see who takes precedence and where does precedence come from. The third prong is and the final prong is the right settlement post-war, or the responsibility and accountability of warring parties after a war. What is the moral regulations after the termination phase of war? This is both providing terms for the end of war, guidelines for constructing peace treaties, preventing vengeful punishment of the victorious party, and includes also political and physical rebuilding and reconstruction of the war-torn states. Here, a drone can come in handy because a human's memory of events and details, especially in stressful situations like battle, pales in comparison to the accurate record that is available within drones. Through data, leaders of political parties now can reconstruct events as accurately as possible and provide evidence for court. So this now leads to ethical implications. Before I get into ethical implications, it's important to note the difference between ethics and morals. Ethics is concerned with what is good for the common, whereas morals is concerned with right and wrong and good and bad. Morals are very black and white, war is very gray, and this is why ethical implications are important when considering drone warfare. We are now past the point of considering where the robots and AI should be used in war. The goal now is to examine how these autonomous systems will be used ethically in the future. The first is humanitarian consequences for the civilian population. As our ability to conduct air attacks increases, so does the threat now posed to civilians. Beyond just deaths and physical injury as collateral, drone strikes cause multiple forms of harm, including mental trauma. The consequence of living in a constant presence of a threat on the sky is a huge impact to the mental health of the just common populace living in these war-torn areas. As well, deployment of radio frequency and GPS jammers used in counter of these drone warfares will also interfere with everyday and often critical civilian infrastructure, both GPS, bank machines, and just common air traffic control. The second is identifying collective versus individual responsibility. Unlike our traditional weapon platforms or planes, the authority of the drone weapon does not just rest with a singular pilot or a singular air crew or a singular commander. You now have a full kill chain of intel analysis, legal reviewers, and military and civilian leaders. But now the question becomes, to what extent are all of these actors guilty by association and interest in drone warfare? And if they are considered guilty in whether they are giving legal, financial, or informational support to some extent, does that mean these actors have now become legitimate targets for counterattacks? We start to see a blurring of lines between military and civilian targets, going back to our legal question of what is a legitimate military target. And the final ethical implication kind of touches on machine autonomy versus moral autonomy, the importance of distinguishing between humans and machines. No matter the level of the intelligence a machine has, the primary concern of an engineer and the designer and the utilization of these drones should not be ethics, but rather safety and reliability, which makes taking that care to address possible risks of malfunctions, mistakes, or misuse that these autonomous systems may pose in the future. So where do we see drone warfare now, especially autonomous drone warfare, in the next 10 years impacting security and defense? There are obviously the combat use of consumer drones, the lack of regulation where you can take a drone that you can buy off Amazon or on the common market and now manipulate it in order to be used for common war purposes. You will see a widespread usage, and it's very hard to regulate these concerns legally and ethically. We also see proliferation. There's no longer that the drone warfare is now limited to the big powers. Anyone can now play on this battlefield, and it's hard to control who and where and when. We also have started to see the rise of drone swarms, where you can send hundreds and thousands of drones, something that was not possible with other means of munitions and warfare, to overwhelm and overpower your enemies. And it's hard to control and how, especially with the ease and the cost effectiveness of a drone. There's also the lack of transparency. The who, the what, the where, and the when of drone strikes is very easy to hide compared to regular warfare, and it will come to the end of the day of what will the ICJ put into perspective of the regulations and the limitations on drone warfare. And finally, most of this has been looking at international conflicts, of course, but we also have the concern of domestic surveillance, the discomfort that these drones can now be used to track the general populace, even outside of war situations. So to conclude, drones have not significantly altered the concepts within the current scope of laws and ethics regarding war and conflict. They've just heightened this importance. There is no chance with a widespread use of drones in the last 20 years to implement a ban treaty. Rather, we should start working towards developing norms and principles rather than the binding legal rules to guide and constrain research, development, and deployment of autonomous weapon systems, especially within the air. As the technology innovates, so will our considerations in the legal and ethical spectrum. But until an AI level of development has machines with intelligence comparable to humans, it is unlikely that there will be need for drastic recreation of the moral and legal frameworks that currently govern the state of nature, because right now, drones are just changing the nature of warfare, not the guidelines that currently govern these actions. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time.